think if you look at our CVs in the design world, vastly different to the CVs in in other industries because they're quite, I'd say, generic, like just a Word document, for example, most times, or a PDF or something. Whereas with our CVs, we really need to design the CV because it's a reflection of who we are as designers. I think having the strongest visual skills doesn't really matter anymore because now you can just ask an AI to help you with that essentially. But if there's any advice I'd give to people, it's I think find the niche and roll with it. What I mean, whilst I think it's important to be a generalist, I think what people are looking for is some sort of subject matter expertise. It's about kind of building trust, I guess, with the people you're reaching out to and really showcasing your skills. I think it's quite important to find something that sets you apart from the competition and really shout out about that.
Hi, Kenneth. Thank you so much for coming to our podcast. And today I will be discussing generally about your story of how you entered into the UX and what you have learned from your experience or any tips. So, before we jump into the main part of the episode, I know you, but I would like you to introduce yourself to our audience. Just a brief background on where you started and how is it going in the UX.
Yeah, sure. My story started during university actually, where I studied computer science, and it wasn't until kind of the second year where I was introduced to the world of UX design or usability engineering, as they called it back at uni. And that's where I realized I really enjoyed making things, but not just coding things. And I wasn't a particularly great coder as well. As a matter of fact, I hated it after a while. That's when I realized again that I enjoyed building products. And when I was introduced to the world of software design, which is more people focused as opposed to technology focused, that's where I thought I could really hone my skills and develop my skills in that area. So that afterwards, that led me on to attending a UX UI boot camp that I did for I think 12 weeks to upskill in the field and get up to scratch with all the relevant tools and knowledge and processes, etc. And then I got quite lucky actually because in the middle, or sorry, rather towards the end of my boot camp, I got a job offer, which was quite exciting. So it's where I started as a really small consulting company doing UX design for the British Army and the wider MOD as part of a digital transformation program. And that's led me now to working as a user experience specialist at a leading law firm.
So it was very interesting. Like you said, you stumbled upon during your education. You're
Mm,
doing computer science, right? I know computer science does cover like usability, web design, and those parts.
mm.
Do you try to change your major a bit more to UX, or did you just stay kept it generic like computer science and then did a boot camp?
Yeah, so I tried to tailor my project work and specifically my dissertation in the final year to something really people centered, I guess
Mm.
you could say. So for my dissertation, I built essentially like a virtual learning environment with some emotion recognition technology, essentially to determine whether people were paying attention in an online learning environment. And I tried to really very basic but limited UI design skills at the time. And I did a couple of years ago, I did look back at my UI design skills and I was like, oh my God, this is horrific. But I did try to lean in more towards that side of things. And in other projects as well, I would designate myself as a sort of designer on the team, trying to focus on the design, not just the functionality, which was what we were told to do as pure developers. There's a bit of by design into my uni work, but I also, at the time with uni, you never know what you're going to do when you graduate, so you want to keep your options open. So I did also keep a little bit general as a sort of backup in case I realized what if UI and UX design wasn't for me, at least I
Mm.
could keep my options open and explore other areas in tech.
So I have a question. Like I know, like even computer science, right? For development, you need to have a portfolio. At the same time, UX, UI, you need a portfolio. So, how did you manage during the university?
Mhm.
Like when you said keep the options open, because for both of them, there is a requirement for portfolio, right? Development optional, but mostly. How did you approach that? from UX especially?
Yeah, so like you said, with the development side of things, it's an optional thing. I think it's considered as a nice to have just to help set you that step further from the competition. So I didn't create one for development at all, even though I could have, because I think I had some projects I would put in there. But with regards to UX portfolio, I actually didn't have one at uni, interestingly, where to start or how to make one. So that's why I did the boot camp to really understand how to get started with a portfolio, what needs to go in there, things like designing a CV, for example. I think if you look at our CVs in the design world, they're vastly different to the CVs in in other industries because they're quite, I'd say, generic, like just a Word document, for example, most times, or a PDF or something. Whereas with our CVs, we really need to design the CV because it's a reflection of who we are as designers, right? So you have to apply the right typography principles, color principles, spacing principles, things of that nature. Otherwise, it's going to affect your ability to get hired, right?
Yeah, especially even though it looks like a simple CV, they concentrate on is the spacing right? Did she or he got the bullet point, like the spacing and everything. Yeah, it's very interesting. So you said about like the portfolio, right? You started the boot camp. One of the reason is because you don't know how to structure the portfolio. So can I ask you, how did the boot camp help you?
Yeah, so the boot camp I did, they had some mentors available, and we had, I think there were drop-in sessions, if I remember correctly. So whenever you needed help with any sort of help with what kind of content to put on the portfolio, looking at the case studies, things like that, the mentors were readily available. I think the other awesome thing was there was a template. So I think my first portfolio was a Notion page essentially, which you push to the web. Yeah, so there was a template for you to work off of. So that made a little bit easier because you don't have to think too much about what website builder do I need to do? I need to code it? Can I use a tool, for example? So yeah, getting that jump start, I guess you could say, was quite important.
And what about the projects? It's like I heard something, right? Like when you're trying to enter an industry, example, a military or law or banking, even when you apply, I know there's a lot of pressure, I would say nowadays. Oh, we don't see a similar projects on your portfolio. Or did you find that same thing? Example, if someone is applying for a pharma field or something like medical related, they want to see a medical related case study for UI UX so they can much more relate. So, how did you approach that? Like in the boot camp, because you went to military, right? Like directly the military application or something. You work for it. That's a very unique. How did you approach it for the case studies on portfolio?
Yeah, I think it really depends on I guess the industry, because I think with some industries, if you're planning to have a niche, for example, so you want to be a UX designer who specializes in healthcare or this industry or that industry, it can be important to tailor your CV to that particular industry. But I think on the flip side, it doesn't really matter too much what kind of case study you go for. I think that the main thing that hiring managers look out for is your ability to problem solve, because I think that's where our skills as designers really come through, not necessarily whether we've tailored our CV to a specific industry. And it's certainly something that I would look for if I were to hire a junior, let's say. I wouldn't worry too much about what industry their case studies are for, as long as they're applying the right design thinking and process and their ability to, tell a story, for example. I think those are more important. I think for me personally, I remember when I was doing my boot camp, we had two projects that were fortunately real world case studies, which I think was really important to making your portfolios a little bit more appealing and definitely for the hiring managers. And the first one was on a mental health thing, if I remember correctly, and the other one was a travel lodge booking type system, something along those lines. And obviously, there's no mapping between those case study projects and my real world experience. But like I said, I don't think it really matters too much.
You mentioned a good thing, a design process and the storytelling, right? And what about the visual part? Because if the visual is not good, no one is going to open the process. Maybe it's very good process, but most people sell on visuals, even though they say the process is important. So, what are your thoughts on it?
I think it really depends on who you are as a designer and where you're coming from. I think for me, for example, I can confidently put my hands up and admit my visual skills aren't the strongest. And if you compare my portfolio or my visual work, I guess people who have backgrounds in, say, graphic design or art or more creative fields, I think generally their ones will tend to be better. I think it just depends on what industry you're going for. If you're applying for company, the visual side of things, I think it does make sense to have a very visually appealing portfolio with all the fancy animations and whatever. But I think if for me, for example, because I've worked in the enterprise space for a while, it's less about the visuals and more about the process and being able to take something really complex and make it really simple and useful and usable. So I think it really depends again on the industry. I think it's also important on that note to strike a balance between the two because I've seen some portfolios, for
Mm.
example, which are really visual, but there's nothing to support that. It's okay, cool. I'm just looking at a bunch of visuals, but it doesn't really tell me anything. And I think whilst that's a good thing, I think especially now where AI is so prevalent, I think having the strongest visual skills doesn't really matter anymore because now you can just ask an AI to help you with that essentially. But on the flip side, I've also seen some portfolios which are really process heavy and a lot of text on why we did this and why we did that, etc., etc. And yeah, it's not always doesn't always make for the best read, right? So I think it's important to strike a balance between the two and really appeal to the hiring managers.
So, can I ask you something? I'm assuming no one will be there with the first company they started, right? It's better early in the career. They said you have to keep moving. That's how you learn, like maybe 2, 3 years. So, can I ask your approach? Like, you said, like the first job you got lucky. What about the second job? What was your strategy?
Yeah, I also got lucky with that one. I have to admit, I got referred essentially, so I got quite lucky in that regard. But if there's any advice I'd give to people, it's I think find the niche and roll with it. What I mean, whilst I think it's important to be a generalist, I think what people are looking for is some sort of subject matter expertise, for example. I think some of the best designers out there really understand a particular domain very well. That could be like fintech or healthcare or something like that, and problems surrounding it. And it's easier for you to apply other principles outside of visual design, for example, like thinking about how different systems work alongside each other and things of that nature. So that would be my advice.
So you mentioned a very good point. It seems like I don't believe in you must have been doing something right. As you mentioned, referrals, because nowadays with the job board, if you see so many fake jobs and all those stuff, and most people are getting hired through referrals. That's much more like a trustworthy. And is the right one of friend? Is it the right opportunity or not? So I'm assuming based on what you said, you must be really good with networking. Not like a networking, but really good at building professional relationships with like other professionals. How what was your approach there? How did you actually build the community and network around you to generate opportunities?
I wouldn't say I'm the best at networking, but I think as far as networking goes, it's about trying to think of the best way to word this. It's more than just building a relationship. It's about kind of building trust, I guess, with the people you're reaching out to and really showcasing your skills. I think it's quite important to find something that sets you apart from the competition and really shout out about that. Because I think that's how you wow people. They're like, oh, wow. Because if you get 50 odd people messaging you saying, hey, I just want to connect, and whatever, it's okay, cool, great. But if you have something unique, I guess, that you can really talk about and leverage, I think that will be very important and like game changing essentially in terms of how you approach the connections.
So I want to expand on it. Like,
Sure.
how do you create that wow factor?
For me, it's quite boring because I specialize in a very particular tool stack, for example, which is a business application suite by Microsoft. So it's not the most exciting thing. But if it was any other instance, I think comes back to my point about like finding a niche, for example. I think people really value that. And I think, I don't know if you've noticed, but some job ads out there, for example, are really tailored to a specific industry or technology platform or AI, for example, or really specific things. I found there's a lot more. I think there's a lot less demand for generalist designers and a lot more demand for we need people who specialize in X, Y, and Z. And if you can do that and upskill in those areas, I think that will help.
And again, expanding, can you say what you meant by specialized? Because two things, if you're talking about like the Figma and the tools, those are changing. Or do you mean when you specialize with like in a particular niche, did you mean an application? Or remember at the start of the conversation, we're talking about like the industry specific. So I'm a bit confused. Can you just
Yeah, I specialize in a family of tools called the Microsoft Power Platform, which is Microsoft's low code, no code offering for business applications mainly. So you've got Power Apps, for example, which is to create the actual applications. What I'll work with most because that's the one with the layer on it. There's Power Automate, which does some automations, and then there's Power BI, which is all about data visualization. And those suite of tools all connect with the wider Microsoft ecosystem, so Office and beyond, for example. So I think because with my first job, valuable solutions quickly and low code tools enable you to do that really effectively. And because generally most enterprises or organizations run on Microsoft
Mhm.
because that's the sort of preferred technology because it all integrates together very seamlessly, going from place A to place B and C and D and so forth. It's just very seamless. So that's the kind of technology that I currently specialize in, and that's the kind of niche that I market myself with and bring to the table. So that's just one example, but I'm sure there's plenty more out there with different tools and industries and whatnot.
So if I understood you, like example, I work with Power BI. So you're talking about okay, how does the Power? What are the limitations of the app I can design? What can Power BI support with the design? And do the research. What is like example dashboard design? Understand what's the problem? What are the users? How can we put what graphs? Like in there is an also available list of charts. You can't create like out of the box. So are you telling me like, okay, understand that ability to connect the dots and design and user experience, that's the specialization.
Yeah, so with me specifically, it's a lot less about the visual side of things and more about understanding people's pain points and the pain points of the business and understanding those requirements. With the suite of tools that I use, like you mentioned, there are a lot of restrictions because it's not like everything is completely customizable, like in the high code world, for example. And that sometimes presents some UX challenges that we have to work around, make some compromises on. Generally speaking, it's, you know, I think sometimes it puts you in a little bit of a box because you're quite limited as to what you can do. But to think about the creativity that unlocks, because you have to be a bit more creative to work around the constraints that you're working with. But yeah, generally in terms of how I approach the sort of I guess traditional design process, it's a lot of research in the sense of conducting user interviews and things of that nature. It's very
Classic
bespoke
user
design, I
centered
would say,
designer.
because we're not designing things. Yeah, I would say it's very classic user-centered design in the sense that it's we're designing tools for the masses, designing, Sona, for example. And I think that the other thing to mention is with the tools we design, we have to get it right because some of the tools that we design, these are tools that people are using to do their work, right? They'll be using it for hours and hours a day, not like a consumer product that's just out there that people may use for 5, 10 minutes to accomplish a certain goal. So there's a lot of research, thought, and consideration that goes into that. And then obviously producing the mock-ups and actually getting a little bit involved in the development as well to prototyping code, if you will, because obviously we work in the low code space. It doesn't take as much time for me to put together a more realistic feeling prototype, if you will, in the actual platform itself, which I think is really beneficial because there's nothing better than showing a quote unquote prototype to a user, which is using real data so it feels real rather than showing some really static Figma mockups, for example, where you have to say, oh, imagine this and imagine that. And then the feedback you get isn't as strong, for example. Kind of rambled on there, but I hope that makes sense.
Yes, basically, you're not depending upon Figma or something. Like you can actually go in there, understand the problem, put out a
Mhm.
prototype, actual prototype. Like Power BI, if you design a dashboard, is actually pulling the actual data to inform. So there is no, it's a very quick design solution for a problem with the real data. Did I phrase it
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, so for us, it's all about speed, delivering quickly, but importantly, not compromising on quality, because obviously there's generally a trade-off. The quicker you go, the lower the quality. But we try to strike a good balance between the speed we're delivering at and making sure that all the requirements are met. And then with my team in particular, one thing I really like is we like to under-promise and over-deliver. So as sometimes during the research phase, you get these golden moments from the insights of, oh, we could do this really cool thing that will cut someone's time by 30 minutes a day, which may not sound crazy. If it's a really manual process and we're automating it, for example, that's game changing. Or being able to do things like that. Or in the context of Power BI, like you said, it's all about getting something in the hands of our users quickly, rapidly getting their feedback, and then iterating quickly. I think we like to apply a lot of lean, design, UX design and development practices compared to traditional high code where it's a little bit more slow pace, I guess you could say, because there's a lot more steps in between. So for us, it's all about, in terms of the lean UX side of things, it's all about working off of hypotheses, for example, which we can quickly test and iterate upon, and working with other frameworks like jobs to be done, for example, as opposed to the traditional user stories, and really making sure that we're iterating rapidly, testing rapidly as well.
Just like leaning into you're describing your role, right? How would you do? That's very interesting. I'm assuming like because you're not working with the developers, if I'm right. Like I work at this moment in my career for the past 1 year. I'm not working with Microsoft Power BI, but I'm working mostly with like actual developing the product. Would be agile software development. It's more
Mhm.
development focus we have to fit.
Yeah.
But you mentioned lean UX model, the rapid thing. Like, how is the job, like actual job? For me, I have stand ups, retrospective refinements. How about your job would differ? Is it
Yeah, I think with the whole software development lifecycle, it's very easy for people to get caught up with processes that are out there. I think we have a process that we've I think just adapted the standard agile, the two weekly sprints and whatnot. But we do our own little twist on it because it doesn't quite work well in our environment. And I think it's important with just any process in general, let alone agile. I think also if you think about the design thinking process as well, especially like juniors, they get caught up in making sure, oh, I have to do this particular, I have to do personas, I have to do user interviews, I have to do surveys. And then once I've done all that, I have to do X, Y, Z. I think people get caught up very heavily in the different processes and the roles around them, and to define your own process and see what works for you, what works for your team. For example, we don't have a scrum master. I know that's like a traditional role in the agile world, but we don't see the need for having a scrum master. So we just don't have one. We do have a product manager and dev leads and people in our team because we are a lean team. We all wear different hats. I think that's nice because you don't need fewer layers of bureaucracy and things like that. Because I've seen in agile environments where I think because there's so many moving parts and people involved and so much process that things just move slowly, because people are so fixated on the process. But I think if you want my advice, just work with your team to define a process that works for them. I think more importantly for the devs, because they're the ones that will be actually doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of the tickets on the board and things of that nature. But yeah, I think that would be my advice in terms of the agile workflow and things like that.
So just going back at the very thing, you said like how you market yourself to attract opportunities and reference. I specialized in this, so I'm really good with that. But how do you actually like, okay, you keep it on your LinkedIn profile, or how do you actually strategize? Because this is one of the point I want to dig in, because you can't go to a person and say, hey, I specialized in this one. But you don't know, sometimes the world is so big. How do you
Mm.
position yourself? Is it via LinkedIn, or are you active in meetups in a good way? Oh, I can talk on this subject. This is my specialization. Or how would you strategize that one?
Yeah, I think it's different for everyone, right? I personally am not the biggest fan of LinkedIn. I like going on there because sometimes there's good learning content. But generally, I think it's a pretty weird and toxic place. But in terms of how I kind of network, I do attend meetups as much as I can and actually get to know people. And I think that's better. It's more organic, I think, as well than cold messaging people. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but for me, I try to be as active in person as possible because I think that that is a more, as opposed to cold emailing and cold messaging. But I think as well, LinkedIn can be used for good. I think if you've got a niche as well, I think there's no harm in posting about a certain thing because once you start building your network or connections, whatever, people will have visibility of what you bring to the table. And if you specialize in something really unique, then before you know it, all the recruiters will be in your DMs asking you, hey, I see you specialize in this thing. We need someone ASAP. Please come join us.
And coming to the end, so what was your experience with hiring? Referral is just only getting into the door, and you have to prove yourself with the interviews and all those stuff until the final round. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
what was your, how did you prepare for the interviews, and what was your experience in general with the hiring?
Yeah, the hiring process went pretty smoothly, I would say, thankfully. In terms of preparation, I try to really tailor my answers to the industry. I'm sure this is probably an like shared piece of advice, but really doing your research makes a huge difference. I don't know much about law, but I know enough, I think, to understand how my experience and knowledge as a UX designer, as a generalist, marry that up with my knowledge experience in, say, the Microsoft Power Platform. I do those two together relative to the field of law. I think it's about strategizing in that way, thinking a little bit holistically, let's say, and seeing, okay, what do I bring to the table? And, is this what I'm actually after? Because I think even when I was applying, it's like sometimes you just get caught in, you just go down rabbit holes of, okay, this looks interesting, I'll apply to this. But then sometimes when you find out a bit more about the company, or maybe this isn't the best, this is really what I was after. But yeah, I think it's also a case of having confidence in what you say and saying things with conviction as well, and really know your stuff as well. Because I remember I got quizzed on my UX design knowledge, which, yeah, it was a bit daunting. And I was like, oh, got to remember all these techniques and why they're important and how they solve the problem and how it relates to my experience, etc., etc. Yeah, I think the interview process never, just making sure you're as prepared as you can be. And I think, yeah, just be confident.
So, you say like confidence is the key. Like, even though you prepare, if you're not confident, then it may go, it may not come across well.
Yeah, I think you have to be confident, but not confident rather, but not cocky, because obviously you gotta. It's all about marketing yourself, right, and selling yourself and the services you offer. And I think sometimes it's okay to not have all the answers as well, because I remember I didn't have all the answers. But some people, I know it's hard to say, but try not to panic if you don't have all the answers. Just admit that you don't. The reality is, right, when you're in the working world, and I didn't know this when I was at uni, for example, is I thought, oh my God, I have to know trillion things, otherwise I'm not going to get a job. But the reality is, if you don't know things, it's okay because we may not be in school anymore, but you're still learning. Like I'm still learning, and I still consider myself, for example, to be a junior designer even today, even though in my previous role I've held different titles. So much that's happening. The tech scene, as we all know, is evolving at lightning
Mm.
speed. There's always new things to learn and to know, and even techniques and processes. My old job, I had my old manager who's telling me, "Do you know what this design technique?" And I was like, "Never heard of it before." It's okay because we're all here to learn and to progress together.
So, how do you upskill yourself? You have to constantly learn new things. But if you go down that rabbit hole, it's like a self improvement for so many things. But how do you decide which skill to upskill? Because sometimes they may be conflicting. And how do you actually take time, strategize, and actually progress?
Yeah, this one's quite hard, I think, because it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. But for me personally, to be as I try to keep my finger on the pulse when it comes to both the design world and the tech world. So I'm constantly on looking at LinkedIn, design Twitter, and other social media, design Instagram, for example, just looking at what new products are coming out there, what services are out there, just really being, I guess, present and consuming as much as possible to acquire the knowledge I need. And even for me, because I'm in the Microsoft world, I try to. This one's quite tricky because Microsoft's accelerating at an insane pace with, as you can imagine, there's a lot of products under Microsoft, under their banner, and trying to keep on top of all of them is no easy feat. But I do try my best to read, whether it's articles or again, a lot of it does come from social media, just because I know companies love to post, "Hey, we're releasing this new Copilot, we're doing this, we're doing that, blah 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 blah," and really, like I said, keeping my finger on the pulse. But equally on the tools as well. Take Figma for example. They're also innovating at a rapid pace with all their new features and UIs and whatnot, right? So making sure I upskill in those, or even other tools. Like I remember a couple of years ago, I learned about Webflow, for example. So I was like, okay, cool, time to learn Webflow. Then Framer came out, time to learn a bit of Framer. I try not to get too in depth unless it's relative to my role. For example, me having amazing Webflow skills doesn't improve my day to day at work, so it's not relevant. But I at least try to be on top of it with the latest updates and things like that. So it's about, I think, staying on top of the tools, but also staying on top of the stuff, the products that are coming out, and as well with AI, right? I think it's fair to say, like every other week, it's okay, new ChatGPT model, new this model, new that model, new thing is being okay, cool. What does this offer? What is Perplexity doing that's ChatGPT is not doing, and vice versa. So just really being there and actually taking it in. The only downside I think with that is sometimes I feel like it's quite hard to get a bit of disconnect because you just spend like your entire day designing, and then because we live in that world where we do our job outside of our job, if because we constantly have to be upskilling in these different tools and things like that.
But generally, like UX stuff, I know like you talked about very specific, like Microsoft. Do you have your favorite online resources that you would recommend?
I don't know actually. I think I if you see my bookmarks folder with UX resources, there's probably 200 plus now, so it'll be hard to pick my favorite if I'm going to be completely honest. And you know what? I've realized I've bookmarked so many, and sometimes I do find myself going back to them from time to time, but not commonly. I think once, I've weirdly enough, I know some people say, "Oh my God, I always go to Dribble, or I always go to Pinterest or something." I just Google. I think once you've been doing it long enough, you spend less time going to a specific site and more time recognizing things. I'm phrasing it wrong. For example, I think I spend more time just looking at just playing around different tools and apps that are out there and thinking about, okay, I don't know, ChatGPT has done, or this new UI feature that is used for this specific purpose. How can I apply that to my context, for example? Things like that, and thinking and kind of building like your own mental repository, if you will, of, oh, I remember if I'm solving this design problem, for example, this specific interaction, and I'm trying to meet this mental model. And then sometimes I'll just have a thought of, oh, I really like how YouTube did this particular thing. I wonder if that works in my scenario. Then you test it and be like, that makes sense. Cool. I think a lot of design generally is just stealing. So the more you just play around and just as you're using, because we all use like a ton of apps and products and services in our day to day. I think for me, instead of just using the tool and being like, okay, I'm going on Uber to, I don't know, Uber Eats. Why have they laid out this thing this particular way and understanding the intention behind it, at least for me. And then I have it photographed in my mind. Okay, this is what Uber's layout for this is. Maybe I can steal that later kind of thing. So that's my doesn't really answer the question because I think there's just so many
No.
tools and resources out there that and I think also just to add, it's important to develop your like product sense, I think they call it,
Mm.
which is your ability to understand like, okay, if I've got this design brief, I can without even needing to speak to anyone, I understand how it's going to be laid out and what the kind of journey will look like and things like that. And the more you're just playing around with different products and apps, you really develop that product sense and flex that muscle. I know I rambled on there, but that's how I get my inspiration.
So that's really nice. Just not actively but passively observing, like,
Yeah.
how did they solve this particular problem? Maybe it doesn't click. The more you play around with the different apps, try to understand. You can't read the case study and everything, but try to understand. And then when you have a similar problem, maybe you can manufacture it in some word that would solve your design problem. So, just the last question. Do you
Yeah.
use AI in your job, like in your UX process? And how do you use it?
So I do use it probably every other day actually. And the way I use it is because we have Copilot enabled. So I don't know how familiar you are with Copilot, but that's basically ChatGPT just for Microsoft, I guess is the best way to describe it. And because the our Copilot is it's tied in to your tenant essentially. So it understands your company's context, if that makes sense. I can use it, for example, I've used it a lot during user interviews because I've recently been doing a ton of user interview sessions. So I get Copilot to record and transcribe the session. And then at the end, it gives me a summary of what was discussed. And then afterwards, I can interrogate it and ask, okay, what are the pain points that people spoke about regarding this particular app or feature or something like that? Right? I think there's a lot of different like methods and processes out there, and I ask it to give like often I'm like, what's the pros and cons of this particular user stories versus jobs to be done? Which one should I go for? What's the pros and cons to each one, and which one's more relevant to my context? I use it for a whole bunch of different things. Nothing visually yet because I don't think
Mhm.
the visual AI side of things is quite for UI design yet because I've played around with it previously and it's very generic stuff. So you can tell it like, hey, can you design me this, I don't know, weather app? And they'll just design the most generic weather app and it's okay, cool, you saved me some time, but what's the point? So yeah, I try to use it as much as I can. And then as well, sometimes because I do a bit of dev work as well. And obviously I'm not a pro dev, so I'll just give it some code and be like, yeah, help me or explain this piece of code for me or something like that. So I try to use it as much as possible. People with the ability to leverage AI will definitely shine more than people who are resistant to AI because it is very important, I think, quite game changing. I don't know about other industries, but in our world, it's definitely a time saver. So very beneficial.
So it's like mostly use it as like an advanced Google search.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. And it's quite useful because, like I said, it has that company context. So if I don't know something, because it has that understanding, it's the response is a lot more tailored
Mm.
with my questions and what I'm trying to achieve. I think as well in our team, we're trying to look into how we can actually use AI as well. So it's important to really stress test the AI tool. Like I said, it's mainly Copilot, right? But really understand its reasoning, its answering, does it hallucinate, how to prompt properly, things of that nature. And when we're starting to think about how we now, because like I said, it's extremely beneficial. And I think just the ability to ask a question in natural language and have a relevant response that's contextual to what you ask is truly amazing.
So we came to the end, and I think this is a very lovely conversation. Do you have any message or key takeaway you want to give away to like people either on building yourself up so you can actually attract the opportunities, or any one key takeaway or how to improve yourself like AI and all those stuff of all the conversation we had? Do you have any key message or anything you want to say?
It's a good question. I think I'm sure the kind of theme that I've been sharing with the advice I've given is to really be a generalist, but also specialize in something. Be flexible, right? I think the more flexible you are as a person, the more marketable you are. And I think as well, especially for the juniors, my number one piece of advice will be to not get caught up in the process. I think coming out of boot camp, right? Whilst I think they're amazing for getting kickstarted in the field of design, I think I've seen a lot of juniors just really focus on the process. And I don't know if you've noticed, but you look at junior UX designers' portfolios, they all have the same structure and format and things like that. And I think it really hurts your hireability if you're just using the same like cookie cutter format and template and whatever, right? My number one piece of advice, especially to juniors, would to think about how you story tell with the visuals in combination with the process you undertook, and yeah, don't get caught up in the process, but really problem solve as well, solve real world problems as well, because I think a lot of case studies are all like the 100th redesign of Spotify, for example. Nobody asked for Spotify to be redesigned, so it doesn't mean anything. But if you go do some concentrated like survey or something, even if it's like 5 people, your family or friends, at least you've done some real world like research and you can talk about that and what you learned. I think that stuff is very valuable because it shows your ability to problem solve and think critically in real world scenarios, right?
So I forgot to ask one last question.
Yeah,
Fine.
sure.
So the thing is, now you've been working for a couple of years, right? How do you keep your portfolio up to date? And because you're working on B2B, you can't actually show the projects you're working on, but still you need to show some sort of projects on your thing. How do you balance it out?
Yeah, that was very tricky. I genuinely struggled with that because I haven't updated my portfolio in I think over a year now, and is due a little bit of a redesign and an update. And yeah, even when like my old stuff, which is still on there, I couldn't show many screens. All the best I could do because I was putting myself in like the shoes of the hiring manager, right? And the best I could do was just say, put like a little banner saying, hey, due to the nature of the information, right? I can't share anything, but I can at least tell you how I approached the process and problem without obviously going into too much detail, the outcome of it. And I think importantly, what lessons I learned, because if you can't go into specifics of what you did or the actual end product, at least you can talk about the things surrounding that, telling the story in that sense. And yeah, it's a tricky one if I'm going to be completely honest. It's something that I will admit I struggle with because I'm like, you really want to show this awesome work you've done, but you just can't. So there are, I think, a couple of workarounds around it. And I think I've seen some YouTubers share some really good guidance on what you can do. But a lot of it is just centered around talking about your approach and that kind of stuff. And I think if you can as well, try and incorporate some stats as well, because that will help tell the story of, hey, I can't show you what I did, but just imagine there was this really bad thing that people complained about, and then we were able to improve it with this new thing that obviously you can't see, but it boosted, I don't know, customer retention by 200%, let's say, then that's still, you can still build that case, if you will.
Perfect. And thank you so much. It's been a
No
wonderful
worries.
session. Thank you.
Yeah, great to talk.